All righty.
Welcome to the Petro Papers podcast. Say that 10 times fast. This is where you get your oil and gas intellectual stimulation by asking the technical questions. I'm Yogashri Pradhan, and with me here today, I have a team. I have Chris Clarkson from the University of Calgary. I have Hossein Ahmadi, and I have Hamid Reza Hamdi. Today, we're going to talk about URTEC 3725840. Paper title and the description is in the description box below for viewers and listeners on YouTube and Apple Podcasts. Now, before I start peppering the team with questions, I'm going to introduce Chris Clarkson for a little bit. He's a professor and Ovintiv Shell Chair at the Unconventional Gas and Light Oil Research in the Department of Geoscience and an adjunct professor with the Department of Chemical and Petroleum Engineering at the University of Calgary. His work focuses in the industry was on exploration for and development of unconventional gas, light oil reservoirs. His research focus, since coming to the University of Calgary in 2009, has been on advanced reservoir characterization methods for UGULO, such as rate and pressure transient analysis, flowback analysis, and has sponsored a consortium called Tight Oil Consortium, focused on these research topics for unconventional light oil reservoirs. He's the author of numerous articles in peer-reviewed scientific and engineering journals. He was an SP Distinguished Lecturer for 2009 to 2010 lecture season, recipient of the 2016 Regional Reservoir Description and Dynamics Award in Canadian region, the 2018 SP Calgary Sections Technical Excellence and Achievement Award, and 2021 Regional Formation Evaluation Award. He also received the 2017 ASC Tech Award for Outstanding Achievement in Applied Technology and Innovation for his work on rate transient analysis in unconventional reservoirs. Chris Clarkson is a certified professional engineer with 11 years of industry experience as a petroleum, specifically reservoir engineer. And Hossein, I was wondering if you can introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me here. I'm Hossein Ahmadi, a PhD candidate at the University of Calgary. Here at Tight Oil Consortium at the University of Calgary, I have been working on developing RTA models for unconventional reservoirs in low earth reservoirs. Yeah.
Awesome. Hamid Reza, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, for sure. Hello, everyone. I'm a research associate in the departments of geoscience and computer science at the University of Calgary, and also an independent consultant working on developing quantitative methods for reservoir engineering applications. I hold a PhD in petroleum engineering from Harriet-Y University and a master's degree in reservoir geoscience and engineering from IFV School. My main research interests include CO2 injection and sequestration, optimization and uncertainty quantification, PTA and RTA, and geostatistical inversion. Yeah, that's it.
Welcome to the podcast, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Well, before I start peppering the specifics of the questions, I wanted to orient our viewers and listeners if you can briefly describe the paper and the methodology.
Sure. So with the questions, I'll probably lead off, and the other two gentlemen can chime in if they had some additional comments. But yeah, so just a little bit about the paper. So there had been some previous papers published by others that had looked at the relationship between GOR and well performance and trying to understand the impact of various factors on GOR trends and then relate those to well performance. And simply stated, if we look at conventional reservoirs, conventional oil reservoirs, the relationship between GOR, mobility, reservoir pressure, trends, etc. For conventional oil reservoirs produced above and below bubble point, those trends are fairly well understood. But what recent authors had pointed out is that in the tight or shale unconventional light oil space, where we're developing these reservoirs with multi-fractured horizontal wells, the sequence of flow regimes is more complex. The GOR profiles are affected by various things: operating conditions, reservoir fracture heterogeneity, fluid properties. amongst other factors. And so for the unconventional wells, the relationship between GOR and well performance is less well understood. So basically, the objective of our work was to study the various factors which control GOR trends and relate these factors to well performance using a combination of field examples and what we call realistic reservoir simulation cases.
To go on those realistic reservoir simulation cases, I was wondering if you can explain the assumptions behind developing the numerical model for the synthetic cases.
Absolutely. So there was actually several different numerical simulation cases that were generated. What I'll do is I'll focus on what we call the semi-synthetic cases, which are what I said, more kind of realistic. And by realistic, I mean that although we used numerical simulation to generate the cases, we used actual field bottom hole pressures. So you could see some scatter in the data. It wasn't perfect like you see a typical simulation case. And so we generated a number of different scenarios. We had cases where we had a very simple fracture to boundary, so 1D flow type simulation. We had a case where we had where the fracture didn't go to the boundary of the reservoir, and we had, we're able to see two-dimensional flow. For that particular case, we call that the flow beyond fracture tips case. And then we also looked at a case where we had multiple fractures with variable spacing, and what we were trying to do there was reproduce this fracture swarm idea, and where you could see a mixture of transient linear flow and boundary dominated flow. And each of these cases really were designed to evaluate the impact of fracture and reservoir heterogeneity and geometry and spacing, and hence the resulting flow regime sequence on the GOR profile and well performance. And we were able to compare both single phase cases and two-phase cases as well. Now, in terms of additional assumptions, we made some of the usual assumptions that are made, simple kind of planar fractures, bi-wing fractures. We used element of symmetry models to speed up the simulation. We ignored things such as capillary pressure and gravity, and we assumed infinite conductivity fractures. We ignored things such as non-Darcy flow effects and the influence of pore confinement on fluid properties. So pretty basic cases that were really designed to look at the influence of fracture geometry on GOR profiles.
Excellent. I wanted to touch upon the initial workflow. Have you seen the effects of behaviors of GOR in infill or depleted wells? I noticed there's a simple parent-child case described in the paper. And then I have a slew of questions after that in terms of, have you seen co-developed cases, and then parents that have been affected by FDIs where there's a potential suppression of GOR? How do you address these cases?
That's an excellent question. Not a super easy one to answer, but what I can say is, yes, in the paper, we really only looked at a simple two-well scenario where we have a parent well that came on production for a period of time, and then we had a child well that came on and affected the performance of the parent well and its GOR profile. But in reality, what we have is, as you suggested, very importantly, is that we have co-development of multiple wells drilled from the same pad or offset pads. And in those cases, there is the possibility that you could see multi-well communication. And in those cases, it's much more difficult to really determine what that relationship is between GOR and well communication, unless the wells have staggered production. So if you have, for example, let's say you have 4 wells, which we studied, and I'll get into that in just a second, where you have one well come on production first, and you're able to look at its initial performance and GOR profile, and then you bring on another one. And if it's in communication with that initial producing well, you can look at the influence that well has on the GOR profile and performance of the first well that came on. And we did study a case like that. In fact, Hossein Ahmadi, as part of his PhD thesis, looked at 4 wells that were completed in a low permeability volatile oil reservoir here in Western Canada. And those wells were developed in kind of a wine rack type configuration where you have upper and lower wells. And his purpose was to history match these wells and try to quantify the strength of communication between the wells. And that was really the objective of what he was trying to do. And for this particular case, the 3 of the wells came on production first for a period of about 200 days. So you could kind of see what was happening with their GOR trends over time. And then the 4th well came on production after about 200 days. And what we observed there was that the GOR profile ramped up very quickly to higher levels than what we saw on the initial 3 producing wells, which suggested that due to communication, there was some depletion of that 4th well that was causing that GOR to ramp up. So there was a case where we were pretty convinced there was communication between all of the wells, but for only one of the wells could we really tell what the impact of the production of the other wells had on its GOR profile. So really, in order to understand those effects, you have to have a scenario where you have some staggered production and you can observe independent production of these wells before you see what happens when you bring the other wells on production. This is something that we've learned from our efforts to develop RTA methods for communicating wells. So both Hossein and Hamid Razan, hence why they're on the call to here today, is they've had experience trying to develop RTA methods where we have communicating wells, and that's one of the big things that we learned is it's a very non-unique problem unless you have this some sort of independent production for a period of time before the other wells come on production.
Excellent. Thank you for that clarification.
Sure.
So I was wondering, why were dimensionless type curves used to evaluate changes in performance when fundamental assumptions of these type curves are constant pressure and boundary dominated flow?
That's an excellent question. We were originally, when we were writing the paper, we were trying to figure out different ways where we could quantitatively or semi-quantitatively compare well performance for these different cases for multi-phase flow, for different fracture geometries and that kind of thing. And it was actually my idea to use the type curves for this purpose. And the reason why we use the type curves is that they provide a very convenient way to normalize data. So you can overlay a bunch of wells onto the type curves. And so for comparison purposes, you could do that. But also, very importantly, is the type curves, of course, were generated using analytical models for specific boundary conditions, inner boundary conditions. In the case of the compound linear flow type curves that we used, those were developed for constant rate production of multi-fractured horizontal wells, and specifically for liquids. So what we could do using the type curves is we could compare the actual production performance for our simulated cases or our field cases to the theoretical solutions for single phase flow constant rate production. And in order to do a more direct comparison between the generated simulated cases and field cases, we convert those cases to equivalent constant rate cases by using the combination of pressure normalized rate and material balance time. And so we convert the data to the conditions for which the type curves were generated. And then, because type curves were single phase flow, we could compare the multi-phase flow cases to that to see how that impacted well performance. So it was a way that we came up with where we could say, hey, we can compare the actual well performance to these theoretical cases, so that we can try to understand what might be controlling those well performance changes. Now, in one of the cases that we studied, we were actually able to demonstrate that if you use pseudo variables modified for multi-phase flow, we could convert the actual multi-phase flow data to an equivalent liquids case so that you can use the type curves quantitatively for fracture and reservoir property derivation. So that was actually one of the cases that we demonstrated in the paper.
I remembered that multi-phase flow case, and I think it answered one of my questions, whether if you can analyze multi-phase flow data by using these type curves.
Yes, yeah, the answer is yes. It's just requires, the calculation of the pseudo variables is not trivial. My group has been kind of working on this for a number of years, but it can be done, and therefore you can, for various flow regimes, right? For linear flow, for boundary flow, et cetera, it's possible to correct the data for multi-phase flow effects and analyze them using the type curves. Now, these days, of course, you may be aware that there's the development of numerical RTA techniques and things like that are also allowing you to correct for things such as multi-phase flow and variable fluid properties and that kind of thing. So that's a kind of a different direction, but it's trying to achieve the same thing, being able to account for multi-phase flow effects in the analysis.
Absolutely. For different case studies covered in the paper, such as the Montney Siltstone, Wolfcamp, and Eagleford, could you describe the extent of how geology might contribute to GOR trends in different reservoirs?
Sure, another great question. Kind of a difficult one to answer simply. There's a lot of factors that can act together to affect GOR. Some of them obviously discussed in the paper, the effect of completions, the operating conditions, fluid properties, et cetera, but geology is also extremely important. So there's several different components to my answer, if you will allow. First is that we know that GOR, contributing to GOR is both solution gas and free gas. And the solution gas is a function of the fluid type. And the fluid type is affected by the source rock thermal maturity, any preferential fluid migration that might be happening in the reservoir, et cetera. So there's a geologic overprint on that, as you know. The free gas is a function of relative permeability, which in turn is affected by geologic properties. So geology enters into that, both directly and indirectly. We have, the geometry and the distribution of the hydraulic fractures and the natural fractures is a function of geology and specifically geomechanics. And of course, the completion affects that as well. So those are intertwined. We know that matrix permeability can affect the GOR, i.e., lower permeability means higher drawdown, higher pressure drop, which could affect the GOR value as well. The flow regime sequences are at least in part controlled by geology. Reservoir heterogeneity in particular can affect the interpreted flow regime sequence. What else? Oh, layer effects. So if you have a multi-layer type system and your fractures grow up and down into layers that may contain different fluid types, we have seen this in some of the reservoirs that we've looked at, and you're producing commingled back to the well. You can be mixing and matching fluids with different initial fluid properties in those systems, and that can affect GOR. We know that for multi-fractured horizontal wells, the reservoir quality, the completion heterogeneity, the completion quality can change along a lateral, and you're commingling these different systems together. So depending on the degree of heterogeneity and the completion of the geology, that can affect GOR. Lots of other things. The other one that I'll hit on that's a popular topic these days is pore confinement. So we know that in certain shale reservoirs, for example, because we have pore sizes in the matrix down to kind of the nanometer scale, fluid behavior in a confined nanopore is different than it is in the PVT cell that you measure in the laboratory. And so that difference in fluid properties can can change the GOR behavior, manifests itself in terms of things like bubble point suppression. You've probably heard that term as well. So that directly affects the GOR profile potentially as well. So it's a difficult question to answer, and to be able to address that rigorously, you'd start with simulation cases, you'd handle the problem stochastically where you're varying all of these things and try to look for relationships. But it's a difficult problem with real data, of course, because there's any number of these factors that could be acting simultaneously to affect the GOR profile.
Awesome. I know there's so many factors to take into consideration when it comes to geology.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Could you explain the importance of the kind of data resolution or data needed in order to conduct the type of work that you've done?
That's also a very good question. Yeah, I wrote a book on RTA last year, as I mentioned, and we talk about data quality issues in quite a bit of detail. But in general, one of the things that because we're trying to relate GOR to flow regime sequences and well performance, that of course implies that you have to be able to identify flow regimes accurately. And for production data, that's not always straightforward because of the data quality and resolution, as you pointed out. So in general, some of the recommendations that I would make is that downhole pressure data, Tom Blasingame, my good friend Tom Blasingame, has been thumping the table on this for many, many years. If you have downhole pressures, you can take into account or take out of the equation to a certain degree what's happening in the wellbore between the surface and the sand face. So having downhole pressures is great, particularly for multi-phase systems where correlations from surface pressure to downhole is not always 100% accurate, particularly for three-phase systems. The measurement quality for the rates, allocated production, it happens, right? And depending on the frequency of testing, that kind of thing, that dictates the quality of that. If you're dealing with three-phase systems, water rates aren't always the most accurately measured. Tank strapping and things like that can lead to errors. There's a very, very good paper for the listeners. There's a very good paper by Daryl Tompkins published at the URTEC conference in 2020, and it's URTEC 2515, and he talks specifically about data quality issues, provides some recommendations on how to obtain high quality data for rate transient analysis. And he talks about the implications of if you don't have good data, how that can affect the analysis. So I would refer you to that. But I can say there was a paper that we presented at URTEC 2022, along with the one that we're discussing here. It's URTEC 3705570. And it was a study that we performed on an Australian shale gas well, and it is the highest quality data I have ever seen. So for that study, the operator had collected ultra high data frequency. So the rates were collected at actually better than 15-minute intervals. We had to average up to 15 minutes. For these extended flow tests that preceded buildup tests. And when we performed the log diagnostic analysis on the data, the flow regime identification was just as easy as the buildup test. So the quality of the data was very, very comparable to the buildup tests, which I've never seen before. Usually RTA production data quality is not as good as buildup data. But the flow regime interpretation was very consistent. We were able to do a quality analysis on the data, but that's kind of extreme, right? It's very high resolution data, very high quality data. And it was, as I said, they're extended flow tests. It wasn't, for years of production. It was only like 45 to 50 days of production, but the data quality was good enough that we could confirm the flow regime identification that we saw in the buildup test. Now that's an extreme case, as I said. We're not going to see that very often, but to the best that we can, collecting that type of high resolution, high quality data for the purposes of the study that we gave, the GOR study. But if you're just in general doing rate transient analysis, that's ideal.
Awesome. And I will definitely put those references in the description box below that you've mentioned. So
Perfect. Thank you.
now I know I've peppered you all with so many questions. There's one that I can't let you go with. So what are implications of this paper that we haven't seen before in this industry?
That's a good question. You always want to have an element of novelty in the papers, and you know, as I said at the beginning, one of the things that we were trying to do with this paper was fill in a few of the gaps. So there had been previous papers that had very good papers that had looked at the relationship, looked at factors controlling GOR in unconventional. They looked at the relationship between GOR and well performance using simulated and in field cases. But there are some additional scenarios that we looked at that are relevant to today's production. One being this idea of looking at the impact of fracture heterogeneity. We know that is something that people are talking about these days. My good friend Jorge Acuna has looked at the influence of fracture swarms on production. He's developed a model to account for that behavior. So we tried to emulate that in this paper to look at the impact that has on the GOR profile and compare it to these other scenarios. And as far as I know, we were the first to kind of look at the parent-child well communication issue and how that affected GOR. So I think we looked at some scenarios that weren't looked at before that are relevant to today's development, and we were able to quantify the degree of deviation of well performance for the two-phase flow cases versus single-phase flow cases. We were also able, as we talked about earlier, to show that we can do type curve analysis on multi-phase data, given some corrections, and we talked about that a little bit. And also we haven't really talked about the field cases up until this point, but we did look at some Avalon and First Bone Spring wells that had quite a wide range of GOR profiles, and we were able to compare the well performance for these different GOR bins, so high GOR, medium, low GOR, superimpose them on the type curves and compare their performance more directly than has been done before to try to understand how the flow regime sequence and GOR is affecting the well performance. And we found that in those cases, the deviations in well performance were fairly subtle, although there was some trends related to GOR. We also found that by using equivalent oil rates, so using basically combined flow rates for oil, gas, and water, by doing that, we were able to superimpose all the data on top of each other. So the decline trends were similar if we accounted for by combining the rates basically in the analysis. So that was another thing that we observed in that particular study. So we addressed probably too many things in the same paper, but I think there's some nuggets of information in there that will be useful for people if they're trying to understand, you know, how GOR relates to well performance.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for letting me ask you all these questions, Chris.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having us.
Of course. And thank you so much, Hossein and Hamid Reza, to also join us on this podcast.
It was a real pleasure. Thank you for having us
Thank
again.
you.
Awesome.
Thank you for having us. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for this Petro Papers podcast going over this URTEC paper. The podcast references will be included in the description box below, as I mentioned before. I'm Yogashri Pradhan, and we're signing off.